1. d4 immediately stakes a claim in the center, fighting for central control and opening diagonals for the queen and bishop. This move, the Indian defenses, immediately challenges white's central pawn and signals a fight for space and piece activity rather than a direct pawn structure confrontation. This move establishes central pawn presence and prepares to develop a queen's pawn to d4, aiming for a queen's pawn game or potentially leading into various Indian defenses depending on black's response. This move develops the knight to a central square, preparing to support the pawn push e7 e5, a common thematic idea in the queen's Indian defense. This move prepares to expand white's central pawn control and supports the development of pieces typical in many queen's pawn game openings aiming for a solid setup. This move, a central pawn break with d5, aims to challenge white's queenside pawn majority and open lines for black's pieces, a characteristic maneuver in the semi-Slav defense. This move, cx-d5, initiates the semi-Slav defense, a solid yet dynamic opening where white aims to control the center and develop actively, while black seeks to build a strong pawn structure and exploit imbalances. This capture recaptures the pawn and establishes a symmetrical pawn structure, leading into the Slav defense, aiming for a solid central setup. Developing the knight to f3 supports the central pawn structure and prepares for castling, while also guarding against immediate tactical threats. This move establishes the solid Slav defense structure, preparing to develop pieces harmoniously and contest the center. This move develops the bishop to an active square, supporting the d4 pawn and preparing for kingside castling while putting pressure on black's queenside. This move solidifies the pawn center and opens the diagonal for the queen and bishop, transitioning into the Slav defense's main lines and preparing for development. This move prepares to develop the queen's bishop, reinforcing the center and preparing for kingside castling. This move develops a piece to its natural square, preparing to castle and solidifying black's pawn structure in the queen's gambit declined. Slav defense. This move develops the bishop to a central square, preparing for kingside castling and potentially supporting a central pawn push like e4 later on. Castling kingside is a fundamental developing move that secures the king and connects the rooks, common in many queen's pawn openings leading to a solid pawn structure. This move, castling kingside, secures the king and prepares to connect the rooks, a standard maneuver in this queen's gambit declined structure to develop pieces actively. The move nh5 is an unconventional attempt to dislodge white's well-placed light-squared bishop, potentially aiming to create weaknesses in white's pawn structure or gain space on the kingside. This move develops the bishop to a more active square, targeting black's knight on h5 and potentially preparing for a kingside attack by opening lines. This move aggressively challenges white's bishop and aims to gain space on the kingside, though it weakens the dark squares around black's king and potentially creates a backward pawn if white can capture and then advance their d-pawn. This move activates the rook, preparing to challenge the open c-file and potentially support central advances or pressure black's queenside. This move aims to reposition the knight, potentially challenging white's pieces and preparing to support central pawn breaks or defend squares. This exchange removes black's active bishop, aiming to weaken their kingside pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances on the light squares. This capture opens the g-file for your rook and creates an unbalanced pawn structure, potentially leading to dynamic attacking chances against white's king. This move aims to reposition the knight to a more active square, potentially targeting the weakened dark squares around black's king after the pawn structure has been compromised. The king repositions to the h8 square, vacating the g8 square for a potential rook repositioning and shielding itself from the open g-file that has recently been created. This pawn push strengthens white's kingside pawn structure and prepares to contest the e4 square. But it also weakens the dark squares around the king, creating potential targets for black's pieces. The move rg8 begins to challenge white's control of the g-file and prepares to activate the rook on the open file after a potential pawn exchange on f6. This move, rf3, prepares to activate the rook along the third rank, supporting a potential advance of the f-pawn or providing defense for the kingside should the position open up. Developing the bishop to d7 prepares to connect the rooks and supports a potential advance of the e-pawn, while also aiming to contest the c-file. The rook's advance to h3 aims to capitalize on the weakened kingside pawn structure after black's f6 pawn push, preparing for potential infiltration along the third rank or the open h-file. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, anticipating potential queenside play and supporting the advanced kingside pawn structure. This move prepares to expand on the queenside with b4, creating space and potential counterplay against black's slightly passive pawn structure. This move prepares to double rooks on the g-file, creating pressure on white's kingside and potentially challenging the recently opened diagonal for white's queen. This move repositions the rook to the g-file, aiming to create attacking pressure against black's weakened kingside pawn structure, particularly the vulnerable f6 pawn. This exchange simplifies black's position, creating doubled f-pawns which hinders kingside pawn breaks and opens the g-file for white's rook, demanding careful defensive coordination. This pawn capture opens the h-file, creating attacking chances along it for white's rook and potentially the king if black's kingside defense weakens further. The rook now moves to the c-file, aiming to control the semi-open file and potentially challenge white's pieces for influence on the queenside. Kf2 is a crucial prophylactic move, preparing to activate the king along the third rank to support the weakened kingside pawns and potentially connect the rooks. This move is a positional attempt to control the open c-file and pressure white's queenside pawn structure. This move centralizes the queen, eyeing potential weaknesses on the kingside and supporting a future e4 pawn push to gain space and activity. This move, nc4, immediately challenges white's developed bishop and aims to occupy a central outpost, potentially disrupting white's coordination and creating attacking possibilities on the queenside. White prepares to double rooks on the open c-file, aiming to exert pressure against black's queenside and potentially force concessions. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, preparing to challenge white's bishop on d3 and potentially support a kingside pawn advance or create counterplay on the queenside. This move activates the rook along the h-file, preparing to contest open files and potentially attack the black king if it remains on the kingside. The knight boldly enters the center, challenging white's king's safety by potentially forcing pawn exchanges that could weaken the king's pawn shield. This exchange simplifies white's position, removing a dangerous attacker and opening the h-file for potential future pressure on black's king. This pawn capture opens the f-file for black's rook, creating attacking potential against white's king and potentially improving black's pawn structure. By creating an active passed pawn on e4, the move qg4 prepares to exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure by potentially targeting the g7 pawn, creating mating threats. and coordinating with the rook on the h-file. This move opens the g-file for your rook, creating attacking possibilities, but also weakens your king's pawn shield by pushing the f-pawn. This move aims to disrupt black's king safety by exploiting the weakened kingside pawn structure created by 12 gxf6, opening lines for white's pieces. This capture is forced by white's discovered attack on black's queen, and while it removes a dangerous attacking piece from black's position, it opens up the g-file for white's rook and creates a permanent pawn weakness on f6 for black. This move recaptures the pawn lost on f5, but opening the h-file for black's rook while creating a passed pawn for black significantly weakens white's king safety and creates tactical complications. This pawn move creates a vital luft for the king, preventing potential mating nets, while also challenging white's aggressive queen placement. This move aggressively challenges black's pawn structure, aiming to open lines for white's pieces and exploit the weakened kingside. This move prepares to activate the rook on the c-file, aiming to challenge white's control and potentially exploit weaknesses in white's pawn structure. After the exchange on f5, this pawn push advances into black's territory, aiming to disrupt their kingside defense and potentially open lines for white's remaining pieces, while also creating a passed pawn on the g-file. The king retreats to the safety of the corner, preparing to potentially support a central pawn push or create defensive resources if white continues an aggressive kingside attack. This move exploits the weakened dark squares around black's king and opens a direct attacking line against the d5 pawn, forcing black to react defensively and potentially creating tactical opportunities for white. This move is a reactive defense aimed at contesting the powerful white bishop that just entered the attacking position on d5, and it also prepares to support the pawn majority on the kingside. This tactical exchange simplifies the position and removes black's active bishop, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure created by black's previous pawn pushes. With 31 qxe7, black recaptures the knight and exchanges queens, simplifying the position into a likely endgame where white's pawn majority on the kingside might pose problems. This aggressive pawn push aims to open lines for the g-pawn and potentially create attacking opportunities on the kingside, though it also weakens the pawn structure and creates a backward pawn on g5. This pawn capture opens the h-file, creating attacking possibilities for white's rook and queen along this line towards black's king, while also weakening black's kingside pawn structure. This move sacrifices the queen to deliver a decisive checkmate in a few moves, utilizing the discovered attack and the exposed black king. This move is a crucial attempt to re-establish defensive cover for the king, which has been exposed by white's aggressive pawn push and king chase. This move sacrifices the rook to create a powerful mating net, forcing the black king into the open and exposing it to the queen's attack on the 7th rank. The move 34, bg8 is a desperate attempt to shield the king from white's relentless attack, but it also imprisons black's own pieces and fails to address the fundamental weakness of the kingside structure created by previous pawn sacrifices. The queen's check on f5 forces the black king to move, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside pawn structure and continue the mating attack. The king is forced to return to the action, a crucial moment to coordinate defense and prepare for potential counterplay. This exchange on the c-file opens it up for potential infiltration by white's remaining rook, while simultaneously clearing a path for the black king to potentially escape the pressure. This capture opens the b-file for black's rook and centralizes the king, but it also creates a doubled pawn on the c-file and weakens the queenside structure, potentially hindering future counterplay. The king now steps onto the light squares, preparing to actively participate in the endgame by supporting the central pawn majority and potentially creating a passed pawn. This move initiates a crucial sequence where black aims to use the newly opened diagonal for the queen to harass white's king and potentially create counterplay against the weakened pawn structure. The king boldly ventures forward to occupy the center, aiming to become an active piece in the endgame and threaten the advanced queenside pawns. This queen sacrifice simplifies to a winning endgame for white, as black's king is exposed and white's remaining pieces can coordinate effectively to exploit weaknesses in black's pawn structure. The exchange of queens leads to an endgame where white's king is more active and centralized, which is a significant advantage in simplified positions. This move aims to improve the bishop's position by unpinning it from the king and potentially activating it on the queenside, while also defending the pawn on c6 and preparing for queenside play. This endgame transitions into a pawn race where white aims to use the queenside majority to create a passed pawn, while black must defend accurately. This move prepares to create a passed pawn on the queenside by advancing the a-pawn, aiming to exploit white's compromised kingside pawn structure. The king advances to g4 to support the potential passed pawn on the g-file and to activate itself. In the endgame, this move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, potentially supporting future pawn advances or creating threats against white's king. White pushes the f-pawn forward to create a passed pawn and advance their king to a more active central square. The move b-flat3 is a tactical maneuver to trade off black's well-placed bishop, aiming to simplify the position and exploit white's stronger pawn structure on the kingside. With the opponent's bishop actively placed on b3, the king's central position on f4 is now exposed to potential checks and tactical threats, forcing a strategic re-evaluation of its safety and role in the endgame. The bishop retreats to c2, developing an attacking threat on the g-file and preparing to support a pawn push on the kingside, while also reinforcing the queenside's defenses. The king is finally brought into the action, aiming to support the passed pawn and engage with black's active bishop on c2. The king must seek safety on the queenside, away from white's active pieces and potential threats along the open central files. This move solidifies white's queenside pawn structure and prepares to activate the a-pawn, aiming to create a passed pawn in the endgame. This move continues the king's repositioning, aiming to escape the awkward pawn structure and centralize for potential defensive or offensive action later in the endgame. The pawn push d5 aims to create a strong passed pawn on d5, seeking to advance and potentially penetrate black's weakened queenside pawn structure. The move captures an undefended pawn, but it allows white to activate their king and potentially create a passed pawn on the queenside after the queens are exchanged. This pawn move is crucial for activating the passed pawn, aiming to force its promotion by clearing a path and creating a decisive advantage in the endgame. The pawn on c5 advances to challenge white's passed d-pawn and to open lines for black's remaining rook to potentially become active on the queenside. This move captures a pawn, simplifying the position and creating a passed pawn, but it allows black's king to become more active, so vigilance is required. The bishop retreats to c6 to maintain control of the important c-file and to prepare for potential activity on the queenside, while white consolidates their extra pawn. The king's active positioning on e6 is crucial for supporting the passed pawn and creating threats against black's scattered pieces. This move aims to create a passed pawn on the queenside, potentially distracting white's king and pawns while black tries to advance. This move forces the black king into a more exposed position, aiming to use the created passed pawn on the f-file to promote and win the game.